Isn't it the way it goes? You say to yourself, I'm going to do this. And then you do the exact opposite. Or, I'm never doing that again. And then you do it again. It's like I have a split personality. I can give myself all kinds of little pep talks, and I still go ahead and do what I said I wasn't going to do. I decide to do good, and then I don't do it, Paul writes. I decide not to do bad, and I do it anyway. I can will it, but I can't do it. We are confounding creatures as human beings, and this life is a disorienting, trauma-inducing ride. The Apostle Paul was naming a central human experience. He calls it sin. Like Jewish thinkers before him and Christian theologians after him, Paul tries to name this disconnect we experience within ourselves between thought and action. But he goes further. He wants his communities to understand that sin is more than our bad actions or disobeying the laws of a wholesome life. Sin is the existential sense of separation we feel within ourselves, with one another, with God. With a capital S, Paul wants us to understand that sin is big. Sin is cosmic, and we're all wrapped up in it. It is our condition as human beings. Now, you may be wanting to bolt for the doors right about now. Why in heaven's name are we talking about sin? You might be saying. Is this term even helpful? Why should we care? Sin is an antiquated term that bears no relevance in our postmodern secular world. We have psychology, we have genetics, we have the study of the natural sciences to explain things, right? And yet, few words are as potent and powerful to describe the evils that we visit on ourselves and the evils that we visit on one another, and certainly what we are witnessing in the world right now. We are in the throes of sin. We are in the throes of worldwide disconnection camouflaged as hyperconnectivity. We are in the throes of a profound estrangement, and we feel it. We feel it. Barbara Brown Taylor, Episcopal priest and theologian, writes this: abandoning the language of sin will not make sin go away. Human beings will continue to experience alienation, deformation, damnation, and death, no matter what we call them. Abandoning the language will simply leave us speechless before them and increase our denial of their presence in our lives. Ironically, it will also weaken the language of grace, since the full impact of forgiveness cannot be felt apart from the full impact of what has been forgiven. Today we're venturing into some very muddy waters, my friends, as we grapple with the theological term sin, a term most of us have a pretty bad relationship with, myself included, but that we need to reclaim if we are to hold the breadth and depth of what is going on right now. Over the next few weeks, we will be working with various theological terms so that we can ground and nurture our liberal religious faith in rich soil. To be able to talk more in depth with our siblings of various religious traditions across the dinner table or out in the street, and to cultivate powerful language in order to name what we are experiencing in this time, place. I, for one, would like to reclaim the word sin, not as a way to browbeat our neighbors, not as a way to march ourselves out back to the shame shack where many of us mete out our self-punishment, or as a litmus test for categorizing human beings as worthy and not worthy, fully human or a little less than human, saved or damned for all eternity. All of that is too simplistic, and it is not helpful. Sin is a way that I am naming the rip I feel in my chest as I watch cities burn, or a young boy shuffling down a bombed-out street in Kyiv, clutching a lunchbox. He's in a dirty green jacket and frayed snow pants, and his mouth is trembling in agony. He's exhausted. And I watch him as I eat my dinner. Sin is this experience of knowing we have got to make a serious 180-degree course correction in our collective lives if we have any chance of holding off massive extinctions and devastating weather events due to climate change. Knowing all that and driving myself to the grocery store along with millions of others, sin is more a state of being, what it is to be human with brokenness and beauty, than it is anything about a misdeed. The great theologian Paul Tillich, in a very famous essay, writes that S should never be placed at the end of the word sin, because it is a misunderstanding and misuse of that term. He continues, do people of our time still have a feeling of the meaning of sin? Do they and do we still realize that sin does not mean an immoral act? That sin should never be used in the plural, as in sins, but rather our sin is the great all-pervading problem of our life? Do we still know that it is arrogant and erroneous to divide people by calling some sinners and others righteous? For by way of such a division, we can usually discover that we ourselves do not quite belong to the sinners. Since we have avoided those heavy sins, have made some progress in the control of this or that sin, and have been humble enough not to call ourselves righteous, are we still able to realize that this kind of thinking and feeling about sin is far removed from what the great religious tradition, both within and outside the Bible, has meant when it speaks of sin? So many of us have been culturally and religiously browbeaten into understanding sin as our personal shortcomings, or our depravity, or as a way to wage war on the thems of the world, whatever thems fit the political tenor of the day, that it's hard to even wrap our head around the idea that sin points to something much more profound and real. Tillich suggests a word that might be a helpful clue to the true meaning of sin, and that word is separation. Separation. Sin is the experience of feeling separated. That separation we can feel within ourselves, that disconnect we sometimes sense within ourselves, that sense of separation and strain we can feel between one another, the estrangement we feel from the very ground of being or God. We walk around in our lives sensing that we should and want to belong, and yet we are plagued with a feeling of alienation. Unity eludes us. Feeling a part of a flow eludes us. As Tillich puts it, we are estranged from the origin and aim of our lives. We are separated from the mystery, the depth, and the greatness of our existence. We hear the voice of that depth, but our ears are closed. We also understand that sin or separation is more than a state of being, but something with which we can actively participate. We know that there are things we do and say that make matters worse. And yet we keep doing them and saying them despite ourselves. And with that, we have a sense of guilt. These three things, Tillich says, are the component parts of the true understanding of sin. A state of being, a sense of separation, something that is part and parcel of being human, something with which we participate, and the guilt we feel. So let me say that again. Sin is a state of being, a state of separation, a separation with which we participate, a separation that we can accentuate, and the guilt we feel in doing so. When we take up the language of sin, when we understand this estrangement we all feel in the experience of living from the very ground of our being, we are doing a very important thing. We name. And there is power in naming. One of the most important acts of naming that I've ever done in my life was when I named the violence and dysfunction of my own family. For much of my childhood and my young adulthood, I believed my family was like every other family. We had a good family. We told ourselves that over and over again, and anybody else who would listen. We were good church-going members. We loved each other. We really did and do. Sure, I was scared once in a while when things went flying around a room. Sure, I didn't much care for my arm getting yanked out of its socket, preparing for a proper spanking. Sure, my mom would disappear on occasion. Every family has its stuff. And yet, as a young adult, I was plagued with bouts of depression and fantasies of killing myself. There was this deep sense of estrangement I felt within myself, a disquieting sense of being incredibly bonded and alienated from my family all at once. I remember sitting across from a very kind but firm therapist at a local free clinic in my early 20s, telling her a little bit about my family, and her response absolutely floored me. Your family sounds like living hell. I remember just bursting into tears. It's like she took a hammer and split my being wide open in her recognition and in her truth-telling. I spent many years sorting through the broken pieces and the confusion, the wounding and the loving that went hand in hand in my upbringing. It wasn't easy. It was messy, but I talked with my family about all of it. I reread those letters that I exchanged with my parents, and I am floored by the courage and vulnerability in those exchanges. I don't call any of my family members sinners. I don't find it helpful to blame or carry a grudge. I don't think anybody is going to hell. It doesn't mean I haven't been deeply wounded. It doesn't mean I don't carry a big hole in my heart. But we all do. This whole world is full of sorrow. But when I say my family was and is caught up in this human condition of sin, I'm naming the magnitude of what went on. And the power and the grace of forgiveness that broke us open and saved us. The word sin, with a capital S, helps me remember that my family will never be a Norman Rockwell painting. It can't. No matter all the work we did or all the therapy sessions we sat through, the trauma of our generation and the generations past still exist. We just hold it differently now. Everything is not all better, and everything is better. We were what we were, and we are what we are. When we name sin, as religious people, we are not only acknowledging a state of being, a state of separation, we are also practicing the power of holding. The power not to rush in with a Band-Aid when the wound still lies open and gaping, or tie pain up in a nice red ribbon so we can all get on with our lives. I so appreciated the front porch conversation a few weeks ago, back when church member Jim Watson, who is white, and Pamela Bailey, who is black, talked about the connection they discovered between their two families through slave ownership on a large Alabama plantation. At one point in the conversation, Jim picked up on a growing sentiment in the room, from white folks anyway, to tie their story up in a nice bow of forgiveness and friendship and healing. Jim stopped the conversation. And at one point he said something like, "We all have to hold the reality that Pamela and I are connected through violence. The horrible violence perpetrated on her family by my family. We are connected through this violent and destructive practice of slavery." Although he didn't say it directly, they are connected through the rape and brutalization of African women. They are connected by the sin of slavery. When we hold the reality of sin in our hearts, with a capital S, the reality of estrangement that is part and parcel of this human experience, we make room for whole stories. Whole stories. We make room for whole people. I get to be a whole person, warts and all. You get to be whole people. When we hold the reality of sin, we build our capacity to keep our eyes open and our feet on the ground. Author Yolanda Pierce, a Black minister and professor, writes this in her litany for those who aren't ready for healing. Let us not rush to the language of healing before understanding the fullness of the injury and the depth of the wound. Let us not rush to offer a Band-Aid when the gaping wound requires surgery and complete reconstruction. Let us not offer false equivalencies, thereby diminishing the particular pain being felt in a particular circumstance, in a particular historical moment. Let us not speak of reconciliation without speaking of reparations and restoration, or how we can repair the breach and how we can restore the loss. Let us not rush past the loss of this mother's child, this father's child, someone's beloved son. Let us not be afraid to sit with the ugliness, the messiness, and the pain that is life in community together. Instead, let us mourn. Let us lament. Let us weep. Let us be silent when we don't know what to say. Let us decrease so that our brothers and sisters who live on the underside of history may increase. Let us pray with our eyes open and our feet firmly planted on the ground. I place this stone on the cairn of our spiritual path. This stone, I name and hold the complexity, the reality of sin, of brokenness. In the words of my beloved colleague, Luke Stevens Royer, may the naming of sin in and of itself be liberation. And let us hold our righteous anger with grounded ritual, with courageous theology, with compassionate community, that we might not just name suffering and the hell and the sin of this world, but also name the possibility and building up of heaven on earth. May it be so, and amen.